It's
I gotta turn that off. All right, we are preparing. And I'm waiting to double check this live stream just to make sure. And it's muted. Perfect. All right. Let's get it started.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to the 13th installment of the Accountability Success Circle webinar series. And this one, you're in for a treat because with all this going on, if you're anything like us, you probably are juggling so many different things. And maybe, you might not be able to do the things that you really wish you could be doing because other things are taking priority. So we're going to be focusing on something pretty magical. And it's a conversation that a number of people probably don't like having. And it's the topic of boundaries. But my hope for you as you're watching this that you come with a different perspective because you'll be surprised to see the angle that we take boundaries instead of like most people creating the boundary after the boundary's already been crossed and you're a little bit disgruntled. So what we're going to be doing is looking at it from a proactive approach. How do you create those positive boundaries so that you can create the space to do the things that you and I both know that you should be doing? And we have an amazing guest. And so before we get started, I would like to turn it over to her so that she can tell us a little bit about herself. Our guest, Magaly Lamadrid. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I give you a little. And so, how about you just take a moment and just give us the snapshot overview of your greatness? And you're muted. That's cool. You're
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate the beautiful and grand entrance. I'm M. Lamadrid. I am an energy coach and a healer for ambitious women and high performers. I'm all about energy, guys. I don't like to call myself an energy master, but I have so much experience around energy, both on the woo side, the metaphysical side, and also the what you see right now, our physical world. So what I do is I help these women release stress and overwhelm because we all go through stress and overwhelm. It's a part of our life. I help them release stress and overwhelm so that they can get to their next level, whatever level that is, with ease and flow. I always say their next level because each and every one of us are on our own journey, and my journey is different from yours and everyone else out there. So just honoring everyone where they're at and checking to see where they want to go and helping them transform their energy themselves to get to that next level. So that is what I do. Thank you.
Yes, awesome. And there's so much overlap with the work that you do and what happens in the ASC, because I think a lot of what happens in the Accountability Success Circle are these are people who are naturally driven and want to accomplish things, but a lot of times one of the big factors that keeps on recurring, and I think also for me and Gary, sometimes it's one of our biggest blocks when we're trying to move forward through stuff, is that we're constantly bombarded with a lot of things that we have to do, whether it be parenting or, the various projects that we have at work, the fun things that we do outside of work. There's just a lot of stuff that's going on. And so I love this conversation that we're going to have today about boundaries and how to actually set them so that they're to our, in our favor. And, I think this comes at a very important time where we've kind of, we're in this part of it's like a new academic year for those of you who are parents of kids who just went back to school. But we're also, kind of coming off this like 6 months of craziness with COVID. And of course it's still going on, but there's something about the new academic year that gives us an opportunity to create a new start. And so to talk about boundaries and how we set them. And some of us might already have some boundaries that are set, but it's something that we constantly have to revisit, because as your life changes and the demands that your life need to meet change, then you have to change your boundaries. So Yeah, so I think the first thing that we want to talk about is like, why are boundaries so important? Like, why are these essential in order to execute your best work? And I don't know, we'll all just kind of share our perspectives, but Magali or Gary, do you want to go first?
Ladies first.
Okay, so boundaries for me, from an energetic perspective, guys, um, energy is everything. So if you don't have clear boundaries, you're either adding to your energy, bringing you good energy, right? When you bring good energy, you're bringing in clarity into your life spiritually. You're getting a connection. You're becoming more energetically connected to your higher self. And again, on a physical level, when we are bringing ourselves good energy, we're increasing oxytocin in our body, which is actually giving us good health. It's actually strengthening our immune system. So that's why we want to always keep those boundaries on check, because on the other end, if we don't honor those boundaries, we're going to create those negative emotions. We're going to bring in negative energy into our lives, and it's going to create resistance, and it's going to make us feel icky. It's going to, on a spiritual level, get you blocked, right? You're going to cut that, you're going to dim that connection you have with your higher self. And on a physical level, right, what it does to your actual physical body is negative emotions increases cortisol in your body. And over time, what cortisol does to your body is actually weakens your immune system, and it leaves you susceptible for sickness, especially right now in these times, like you mentioned. If you don't honor your energy, if you're not constantly checking your energy, and of course because of the boundaries, you can make yourself sick. So that's why, for me, it's very important to talk about this all day, every day.
Yeah. From a kind of focus and get it done perspective, I think one of the big things that I notice is that a lot of times when you don't set boundaries, you're giving you're giving other people permission to kind of invade your focus, right? So you're working on something and then somebody calls you, or you're working on something and your kid comes in. You're working on something, the doorbell rings. There's all of these distractions that take you away from your focus, and then you have there's this like time lag that you're going to have to get back on track and say like, okay, now I need to. And obviously all of these things happen. You get interrupted and you can't always predict everything, but sometimes you can slow down the craziness with some intention. So as an example, my son usually does some of his schoolwork in my office, and I told him that I was going to be on this call, and so he is now in the other room, and everybody in the house knows not to come in here unless and so I have set those boundaries. So from a focus perspective, you want to be able to proactively kind of see or preemptively anticipate what might become a distraction that prevents you from getting things done efficiently and quickly, and use that as a way to basically like level yourself up and making sure that you get stuff done. So Gary, you have anything on that?
Yeah. No, you nailed it. The one thing I want to, sort of champion and piggyback on is being your best self. To Magali's point about your energy, excuse me, and when you set those boundaries in the right way, you don't have to worry about increasing cortisol, the stress hormone that is going to, wear down your immunities, and you can focus because you're not using that psychic energy of like, I don't know, is something going to happen? So, I'm all about being my best self, and I notice that when I don't take the time to create the boundaries that are appropriate, yeah, I'm more irritable, I'm more stressed out.
Yeah. So let's take a minute and think about next. There might be some myths or roadblocks that keep us from setting positive boundaries. What might some of those, like, how might this look like in for those who are watching this either live or on a replay? How do we know when we need to maybe set more positive boundaries? I'll start with an example of maybe feeling like some sort of guilt around feeling like I have to do all these things, and then knowing that like pretty much everything that is on my to-do list has some sense of urgency, and that you know, you can feel that stress and overwhelm building up. You think of any other ideas in general?
I think as it pertains to the myths, um, a lot of times people assume that others should know your boundaries.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's a good one.
And that's where, again, when you're being proactive, the reason why it's called, in my opinion, called a positive boundary is because it's all about having a positive outcome. And positive boundaries are a little bit more challenging because it, in my opinion, forces you to be forthcoming about your intentions and let the appropriate people know what you are trying to do. And as a result, it allows you to create space for, instead of what usually happens, as I mentioned earlier, you realize that that boundary was crossed. Now you're frustrated, and now you're going to go and sort of like you should have known this and this. So it's all about realizing that people don't know what your boundaries are unless you're intentional about them. And yes, it is challenging, but in the long run you will have more benefits because it creates space.
Yes. So we're all about creating that space for you. How about you, Magaly? Any thoughts on any myths that you know of surrounding creating positive boundaries, or any roadblocks that seem to pop up, or any sort of signs or indications that somebody might need to revisit their boundaries and set some new ones?
That's a good question. Now, I'm coming from a trauma perspective, right? I've had a background in trauma and I've worked through a lot of craziness. If you are, well, chances are, if you follow me, or even if you come across, if you know usually, if you've been through trauma, you know it. Understanding that when you have trauma, or you've had trauma in your life, and it's a part of your past, you have to pay very particular attention to your boundaries. Because for a long time, for myself, for example, my boundaries, my normal was not normal. So when you come from a traumatic background, you need to really be careful about what your boundaries are, because your programming is most likely not healthy. So, understanding and becoming aware of that, and saying, okay, I know boundaries might seem simple for you, Apryl, and for you, Gary. Let's just say, if you haven't had trauma, I'm not sure exactly the background, but for people who do have trauma, your boundaries, if you haven't visited the boundary, your boundaries, your values, I encourage you to visit that, because there's a big chance that you don't have healthy boundaries. So I think that it's important to be aware of that and mindful of that, and not from a space of shame. I have a traumatic background, oh, poor me. No, it's more like, oh, hey, my normal was not normal. So I need to check what I have going on to make sure this feels good, and always, again, the whole revisiting, I think. So that's what comes to mind for me, when I think about what you're saying in terms of myths. Like, boundaries may seem very clear for some people, but for people with traumatic backgrounds, they're not as clear. And it's okay. It's just understanding and learning and creating and revisiting a little more than the average person that has not experienced trauma. So
Yeah. And I think even from that perspective too, because of the fact that, we're talking about positive boundaries, we can't just say this is a boundary that you need to set. For every person, there's going to be a different way that boundary shows up. So for somebody like me, maybe I haven't experienced trauma, but I also know I need to be more cognizant of the boundaries that I set around work, because sometimes I tend to like to be a workaholic and over deliver on everything that I do, to the point where it's depleting all of my energy. And I might say, here's what I can do, but here's my stopping point. My stopping point might be here, where the average person might be here, or maybe they're even like further than I am, because there's certain limitations that I have with, in terms of when I'm actually feeling the stress, where I have to pretty much shut down to keep myself at this, this boundary level of burnout that I can't cross because I've crossed it before, and I know how that manifests in my autoimmune situation and all of that stuff. So also, as you're going into this, as we start to talk about actual strategies and different ways that we create these boundaries, you want to think about, what's my level of tolerance in, for my energy, for my, like overwhelm, like what can you tolerate, and know that boundaries that you set for yourself might be different from boundaries that you set boundaries that others set. Sorry.
Yeah.
So
one other thing on that point to just piggyback on what Magaly mentioned is that I feel like when people hear, oh, positive boundaries, they immediately think, oh, these are just these happy things. And positive boundaries, especially if you're trying to have a positive outcome, does not always equal easy. It doesn't always equal comfortable or happy, especially if these boundaries are rooted in relationships. If we're looking, and we'll go into the different types of boundaries that you should be thinking about and considering in just a moment, but it may require having some uncomfortable conversations because, as Magaly mentioned, maybe you're having a deeper understanding about yourself and potential previous trauma, and now you're trying to right the ship. And maybe someone that you've been in a relationship, and it doesn't always mean a romantic relationship, it could be a business relationship, it could be in a cordial relationship, it's been used to you acting a certain way or behaving a certain way. Now you're trying to adjust that, and that will require you having some conversation so that they know your intentions. And we'll talk about how you can understand who you need to have a conversation with as you think about those boundaries in just a moment. But just know, just because we are talking about positive boundaries, it doesn't mean that this is just a happy-go-lucky thing. It can be challenging.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so are we ready to just kind of dive in? I know this is the big meat of our conversation today, which is actual essential components to having healthy boundaries. So there's certain things that you need to know and need to have in place in order to craft these boundaries for yourself. Are we ready to dive in?
Do it!
All right, so the first one is knowing your values and priorities. And Magaly, I'd love to hear from you why this is such an important piece of, because, it's not just, knowing your values isn't the boundary itself, but it is something that is essential in order to create those boundaries, correct?
Yes. So it's crazy because I wrote this down and I don't remember where I got it. So I'm going to say it's not from me, it's from something I've read.
Oh,
but it's something along the lines of value is your soul's GPS. So in the metaphysical world, we talk about GPS in terms of our emotional, it's the GPS of our emotions. Mm-hmm. So when we define our values and we create boundaries around that, we can basically set a nice foundation for what we want in our lives. So, for example, if you don't know what your values are, right? Like values such as family values, values such as, for me, spirituality, freedom and integrity. If I don't know or create boundaries around that, remember, we're working unconsciously 95% of the time. We're going about our days saying, well, I'm just going to say yes to so-and-so. We're not even going to be thinking about what our values are. But when we sit there and say, wait a minute, let me think about this. How is this serving my boundaries? How is this serving my values? How can I create my values around how can I create my boundaries around these values? We are kind of getting in, we're being intentional, right? Because the whole purpose is we want to be intentional. We're getting intentional about these boundaries. Now, what happens is, again, from an energetic perspective, it feels good, right? And especially for someone that's rewriting their past, right? They want to create a different future. They're sitting there and steering the ship and saying, okay, this is my value. My value is around freedom, right? So how can I create this boundary that I have around this value that I have, around this value of family? I know family is important to me. I know freedom is important to me. So now let me create a boundary that is going to honor that. So therefore, it's going to feel good, right? So because if we don't know what our values are. We're literally walking around like, hey, yes, yes, yes. Oh, it's okay. I'm going to say one of my values is kindness. I'm going to say yes to you because I'm kind, but I'm going to forget that I have a family thing that I have to honor this weekend. So there I am trying to be kind to someone that they want me to go somewhere for them to make them feel good, but then I'm not honoring my actual really hardcore important value of family. So right there I'm just like, oh my goodness. So knowing consciously, you know what? Yeah, I may feel guilty because I'm saying no to this person, but I'm saying yes to my real core value, my family. And that right there is like, boom, okay, it's going to be okay. Again, like you said, it's not always going to be that easy because some things are going to conflict. But when you know those values, those core values, you're going to be like, you know what? Yes, consciously that might bother, but I know subconsciously I'm going to be honoring this. That's really important to me. So it goes back to, again, the energy, right? Finding your values, creating boundaries around those values, and asking yourself whenever you're creating these values, because we're going to be constantly adjusting them, like you said, how is this honoring my value? And it's like, okay, well, it is or it isn't. Okay, well, if it's not, how can I adjust it so it can honor my value?
Mm-hmm.
And then, you do the work, you do, because not everything is just kind of easy. You just do the work. I like journaling. For me, that's like a big thing. But that's why I think that knowing your value is such an essential part of your everyday life, especially when it comes to boundaries. Does that answer your guys' question?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I love this idea to, and I think that everybody in the world should know their values because, when it comes to setting boundaries, you have to, in order to make boundaries, you need to make some hard decisions about like where those boundaries are going to be placed. And the only thing that I know of, based on, the last 5 years of the work that I've been doing, almost six, there's this idea that like your personal values drive all decisions. They are completely your compass in life. And so, I always talk about how I have my values, my top values tattooed on my arms. And yes, I have other values that are outside of that, but these are like the core of who I am. And so whenever I'm trying to make a decision about something, I can refer to my values. So for those of you who have trouble like trying to make a decision between like one or another, you can run it through that filter of your values and decide like which one is actually going to help me get to where I want to go. So a lot of times when even when it comes to buying something, if I feel like the sale isn't authentic or if there's something gimmicky, like I automatically, whether or not it's a good product, I automatically will choose a different path. Or is this going to help me accomplish something? Then yes, I will tend to make that decision more often than not. Is it fun? Like fun is one of my huge values. So if it's not fun, I'm not going to do it. And so I can already use those values as boundaries themselves when I'm trying to make decisions about the boundaries that I want to implement for myself. So yeah, I'm totally on board. I feel like values is like the number one thing that we should all have. And it feeds into everything. Do you agree, Gary?
Totally agree. And once you have those values in place, as Magaly mentioned, it doesn't necessarily, it makes it easier for you to make a decision, but sometimes you have to there might be that fear, there might be that resistance, especially if there's some sort of conflict, but at least it gives you a clear line of sight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. All right, the next thing we want to talk about that's another essential component to creating healthy boundaries is kind of knowing the different types of boundaries that you can set. And Gary, you're going to take lead on this one, right? In terms of explaining there's different types of boundaries that we can set. So knowing that can really help in crafting these personal boundaries, positive.
Yeah. First and foremost, I like to say positive boundaries create space for, negative boundaries create space against. And once you have your values in place, then it's all about it gets fun, where you can like look at these different, I call them dimensions, and there are some overlap between these words, dimensions, and maybe your values, So just take that into consideration as well. But then it's all about like, what do I need to create space for? What specifically? Because once you go through this exercise, you need to communicate these boundaries. I say, if you don't express them, especially to the right people, they're not boundaries. Those are just your hopes and wishes, but they're not boundaries if you're not expressing them to other people. And so these dimensions are the following: physical. So this has to do with your physical well-being, whether maybe it's working out or anything in that realm. Emotional, what are your emotional boundaries? As it pertains to your emotional health, mental boundaries. Anything in this realm could be um, like making space for that mental, having a mental break, maybe meditation, anything in that, spiritual boundaries, whatever spiritual practice you have. Community, making space for people, to connect with them or to do anything related to community service or supporting your community. Financial boundaries. This is something, again, it's so interesting that the money word is so taboo, in the US. It shouldn't have to be. And if you're proactive about that, and you set boundaries, and again, these aren't set in stone, you should review them often and make course adjustments as your values change and as your needs change. But financial is a big boundary that, especially when you get into a romantic relationship, isn't even talked about and it's just assumed, and then you have these clashes, and then then you have to deal with it. Family, what's your boundary around how much time you're going to spend with your family, versus time outside the family? And because we're in quarantine and stuff like that, that needs to be considered and adjusted. Your romantic boundaries with your spouse, or other romantic partners. Have you talked about that, or is there some understanding? And we'll talk about once you look at these dimensions and figure out what's that boundary, how you can communicate it in a way that's succinct, so that you can start a conversation. And then two more: your professional boundaries. For professional growth, for your work. A lot of times, again, because, and I'm speaking, mostly U.S. trends, but in the U.S. there's this cultural thing where your identity is tied to how much you make, or tied to your career, and without having the appropriate boundaries, you may, and I speaking for personal experience, might find yourself working way too hard to the point where you don't have space for those other things that make sense, and then you lead to burnout over and over again. And then last but not least, something true to my heart: your play boundaries. So boundaries for things that bring you joy. Again, a lot of times, Magaly, I love how she mentioned, like, 90 something percent of the time we are walking and moving through this physical space in an unconscious state. And if you aren't intentional and set this ahead of time, your unconscious mind will just guide you. And if this is not something that you're intentional about, other things will take priority, and you will find yourself in that rut and wondering, why am I not experiencing that joy and stuff like that? So those are the dimensions. Anyone else want to sort of chime on that before we
I
move
would
on?
love to, but before we have anything to add in terms of these perspectives, I'd love for all of us to kind of share, just as an example, for those who are watching this, to just think about what would be an example of a boundary in one of these 10 dimensions. But before we do that, if there's any other, I don't know, Magaly, if you have anything to chime in. The only thing that I wanted to say is that, like, a lot of this is, these are the different areas where you might exist and a decision needs to be made. So, understanding that that boundaries can exist there, not just for yourself, but also understanding that other people might have boundaries in those areas. So it's kind of good to think about, maybe, somebody might not think like, hey, like I have a boundary around communities where I, choose to, keep myself in a positive space, right? That's kind of what the ASC is. It's there, whatever's game in the world of Facebook and all the other social media, but we're trying our hardest in the ASC to focus on positivity and moving forward, and being accepting of differences and all of those things. Whereas, other people might have different other boundaries on how they want to set on some of those things. So, Magaly, do you have any other thoughts to add there before we all give an example?
No, I think you've pretty much nailed every single one. Did you? I think spiritual, I was thinking in terms of energetic boundary, by the way. I don't know if that was a part of it, but if it was not, I'm thinking, is that spiritual, energetic? I think I want to say it should be similar or not. If not, it's separate, but that's the only thing I wanted to add to it.
Yeah, I feel like that can definitely, and we'll definitely talk about energy when it comes to boundaries next as well. Okay, so let's play this little game of like setting a boundary. So you can either share a boundary of something that somebody else has had, and you could pick any of the categories, and just give everybody an example of like what a boundary might look like in one of these different dimensions. Who wants to go first?
Gary.
Cool. I'm totally down. So for me, one of the boundaries that actually me and my wife, we have been talking about is our family boundary. And what does that mean, especially now that we're in a pandemic and we have a 3-year-old, and we've, sat down and expressed what our, and it's interesting because this goes into the other ones, like as far as, our mental boundaries and whatnot. And, we sat down and said, all right, now that our son is, and was involved as well, he's old enough to understand certain things. We said to him, Garrett, you can't get out of bed until 7:30. If you wake up before that, that's fine. You can sit there. And we set up a little clock so that he knows when it turns green, that means he can get out of his bed. And again, what that does, it creates space for us to have time apart for each other. And then specifically for my wife, around 1:15, my son, he has quiet time. Again, he doesn't have to take a nap, but he sits in his room, and that space for him to like read books or play on his tablet or something like that. And it gives my wife space to have that mental break. And then we talked about what is needed for us, like as as a family union. What are the things that we're going to do, especially since we're at home more often than not, so that we're just not bumping up against each other and feeling frustrated. So that's something recent, that we had a discussion about, and we involved our 3-year-old, and he seems to be cooperating and stuff like that too.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I could tell so many different boundaries around family that I have set in my house, because it just, when you were saying that, it kind of made me think about like, oh, here's the boundaries that me and my husband this morning were like, can you put a time limit on the Nintendo Switch, because like my kids are now like super into that, and so every time we notice that they're kind of going overboard, we have to set a boundary. So there's a lot of boundaries that can be set on the family side. But I'm not going to give an example for that. Magaly, do you want to go next, or do you want me to go next?
I can go next. First of all, I love the boundary that I love what you're teaching your son. You're teaching him about boundaries with such a simple example, which, by the way, I think that every parent needs to use that, which giving him his hour to decide whether he takes a nap or just sit in his room and read a book. That is incredible, because we have to teach our kids about that. And in that subtle way, you're showing him what a boundary is, where this is mommy's time and this is your time. So that's awesome. So I thank you for that. I mean, my kids are big, but I wish I had known this when they were younger,
Yeah.
So I'll share with you guys a boundary that we have as a family. We have such different personalities. My daughter's 21. She's a girl. Oh, my daughter, she's a girl. She's a 21-year-old girl. My son he's 13. So they're completely different age groups, right? Completely different personalities. We have this thing where it's kind of like an emotional boundary. Whenever we don't feel well, energetically, emotionally, stay out of our way. Like, I don't feel well right now. Just give me my space. And until we feel better, then we come together and talk. That's something that we've implemented. I don't even know how long ago, but they know mommy's having a moment, which I have a moment. I have my moments, right? And the same thing, my 21-year-old girl, she has her moments. Jordan is like, I'm staying away. And same thing with him, because I'm into astrology and he's a Cancer boy. So they're very emotional, and we have to honor his emotions just like when we have our emotional moments. So that's just an example of what I use in my household that's working well, thank goodness.
Yeah. So that can be seen as a family/emotional boundary where
Yes.
like you're paying attention to how each other are showing up and knowing when to give each other space and just having it be outwardly known. Like, if I'm having my moment, leave me alone and I'll be okay a little bit later, which is great because sometimes people need that. Like, sometimes people can blow up, but then maybe somebody's instinct might be like, hey, let me just like sit with you and hug you and whatever, and that might be the last thing that they want. So being able to understand like how you show up in those times where you might not be able to communicate how you want to be cared for in those times is huge. So I'm gonna pick a boundary in a different area. So one of the, I don't even know where this would fit. No, I'll talk about mental boundaries. So one of the things that I have implemented in the recent weeks, because I would notice that I tend to like to work and just always have something to do, and if I can't finish it in time, then I'll say like, oh, well, I'll just take this little thing on vacation and finish it while I'm on vacation, or I'll do this over the weekend, or I'll do this tonight. And I 99% of the time don't end up doing anything. I will bring all of my work with me on a trip, on vacation, just to say like, oh, when I have time, I'll do it. Or I'll push things into the weekend and I'll say I'll just do it on Saturday, and then I just want to veg out. So recently I set a boundary around scheduling anything over the weekends. I just say that there's nothing that can be scheduled other than like, family time, social time, fun stuff. And maybe just the chores, like the laundry, like the mindless, nothing that requires hard thinking on the weekends. And then also trying to, unless there's a meeting that I must attend during a vacation, I will not bring my computer. I will just, enjoy. If I can't do it on my phone, then it's not going to happen at all. And so I set some boundaries around being intentional to take that break, because this is like 5 years in the making for me, because a lot of times I'm like, I just want to be connected and plugged in. But this past weekend, I finished a whole bunch of stuff, and I had some things that I still wanted to do. But I said, I'm going to do it on Monday. And just that release of not having the commitment to like, just maybe I'll try to do it on the weekends, helped me get rid of a ton of guilt. Because a lot of times I'll say, okay, I'll do it during the weekend, and then Monday comes around and I didn't do anything, and then I'm like, I feel guilty, like, oh, I should have done something over the weekend. But if I say, nope, if it doesn't get done, then I'm doing it on Monday, then I don't know, it kind of triggers this weird thing in my brain where I'm just like, if it doesn't get done, then it doesn't get done, and it almost pushes me to work faster because I won't be able to schedule it over the weekend. So setting this boundary has like really freed up mental space, and I literally like laid around all weekend and didn't do anything, and I started on Monday and I was like, oh, I've got all this email that I knew I wasn't going to look at until Monday, but I didn't have this feeling of like, oh my gosh, I'm already behind before I started. So just that quick little tweak of a boundary has just shifted the way that I look at my weekends now. And so I'm going to try it again this weekend and see how it goes. But that's a boundary that I recently set. So there you go. We've got 3 awesome examples.
Love it.
I'm just going to check any questions in both of the chats. But okay, it looks like we're going good. So the next thing we want to talk about is how you manage your energy around boundaries. So the energy itself is a, very important component to setting these boundaries, right? Because I think understanding like what your energy levels are helps you determine what boundaries you set. But how do you manage all of this energy? And I'm going to throw this back to Magaly to
All right.
initiate that
So
answer.
it's interesting because you said something that I was thinking. I was like, oh, you're a perfect example. You're what you're going through is a prime example of what I would suggest you to do. So this is the thing, guys. Managing your energy, first and foremost, you need to be aware of what you are doing. So in the case of boundaries, what are your boundaries? And what is it, how does it feel when you honor the boundaries that you have, right? What emotion is it bringing up within you? Does it feel good, right? So again, just bringing awareness to that, right? Then at the same token, so which boundaries do you have that are not feeling good, that are not bringing up good energy within you, and kind of bringing awareness to what it's creating. So in addition to bringing awareness to what they are, what your boundaries and what energy you're creating, it's like what results. So in your instance that you mentioned, April, you said, because I want to get everything done, right? You want to get stuff done, but you're sitting there bringing all this stuff to your vacation, but you end up not doing anything. And what does it trigger? You're aware that that particular boundary of wanting to get all this stuff done is now creating guilt. It's now creating you to not feel good, and what happens usually when that happens, you actually don't do anything, like kind of what you do. So again, bringing awareness to that and saying, okay, so this is what it's doing, and I know that it's doing that, right?
Yeah.
And so what do you want to do, right? Sometimes you have no choice but to, our ego is going to say, no, we're going to bring all this stuff to my vacation because I'm going to do it, knowing, hey, there's a big chance that I'm not going to do this. And guess what? It's going to make me think about being guilty, beating that and saying, you know what? If I do feel guilty, I know that's my natural reaction, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like beating your guilt to the punch and saying, well, hey, this is just an energetic consequence of what I thought was important, which it is important, but I just didn't have time to do it.
Yeah.
So it kind of like, you just like kind of let that energy roll off. Like you're like,
Yeah.
okay, well, it's all good. No guilt. Next time, I'm just not bringing it.
Yeah.
Again, awareness of what it's doing, awareness of what you're creating as a result, and either A, doing something about it by readjusting, by next time going on vacation and not bringing anything, or if you go on vacation, you do bring it. Okay, so this is the consequence of me doing it. No right or wrong, no shame. It's just I might feel guilty, and either way, it's okay. And just by doing that, you take your power back. You
Yeah.
bring you're like, no, I'm in charge of my energy. I know what I'm going to be doing, and you know what? It's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say that this type of boundary that I just set has been after like 4 or 5 years of being like, well, let me just bring my computer just in case. And then watching my computer just being something that I was carrying with me on every single trip. So this last trip that we took just to visit some family, I had actually the time to hop on my computer and do stuff if I wanted to, but I didn't bring it. So I just didn't think about it. And then when I got home, I was like, it was, it's kind of like an addiction, right? When you're like, I just need to bring my computer because you never know what's going to happen. And, thankfully nothing happened where there was like, oh no, I need a computer. But I also have my phone. And if I absolutely have to, then I can kind of try to navigate that. But it was so great to come back and not feel guilty. Like, I don't know if any of you out there are experiencing that, but that's just something where I was just like, well, let me just in case, because it's always better to be in that place. And here's an example from this weekend. I said I wasn't going to do anything, but then, for about an hour, I hopped on the computer and I was like cleaning my Facebook contacts. I was like, that's on my list. I never had intention to work on it, but I got through a little bit of it yesterday or over the weekend, but it wasn't on the plan. And so I didn't feel guilty about, getting it started. Like, it was just kind of like, ooh, I got a little bit more done. And I didn't feel guilty when I didn't finish it because it just wasn't on the agenda for the weekend. So setting boundaries that way by saying, going into that weekend with intention, like, I'm not going to do any work. And if I do work, great. But if I don't do any work, then I've already won when I get to Monday. And so it's mentally setting yourself into a great space to just start off with success rather than like being in a point of failure, right? So, anything else around energy and having to set boundaries?
Yeah, one thing I like to champion just what you both said of when you don't have succinct boundaries, and you let them waver. Sometimes you don't realize that. Let's take, for example, the work thing of bringing it along because you're like, oh, I'm going to do this, and then you feel guilty, but all the while it's in the back of your head of like, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing this, and asking yourself in that moment, am I being the best version of myself for my family, for like my other boundaries? So like now the work boundary is bleeding into relationship boundaries, is bleeding into like play boundaries. And at the end of the day, like I love what Apryl mentioned, and it's something that everyone should just take stock on and be aware of, is that she was in charge of the thing. Yes, she did a little bit of work, but she didn't have to, but she chose to. But all the while, that energy, because she turned that off, she said, nope, this is the boundary, goes to Monday. So now it's not just taking up space in the back of her brain, which is eating up her energy. Like if you've ever had like one of those old school phones where by the time it's like noon and the battery's already depleted, because so many things are running in the background. Like I feel like that's what happens when you don't have proper boundaries, is that your energy is being sucked up because your brain is like, I should be working on this, but I'm not, and it's saving space for it, and then you're not doing anything with it.
Yeah. So it's like kind
That's a
of
great
dead
example.
energy. I love that. Um, all right. Here's the next component of creating healthy boundaries, and Gary's going to take this one, but it's a huge one, and we've kind of been alluding to this throughout. But the ability to communicate. So communication is such a huge component of that, and in creating those positive boundaries. So Gary, do you want to talk about that a little?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, it is not someone else's job to figure out what your boundaries are, and if you don't communicate them, they're not boundaries. And like unless you explicitly express what they are, they're not boundaries. They're just hopes and wish. And the best way to do this is through language. And so words have power. And so you took the time to understand what your values are, what are the dimensions you want to work on, and then you have a boundary for each of those. The next thing is you need to figure out, well, who do you need to communicate that boundary to? And like we said in the upfront, being proactive creates space for. Now, it doesn't make it easy, especially if maybe up until this point you have been, doing things a different way, and it might require an uncomfortable conversation with someone, maybe your boss, maybe a romantic partner or a family member, or something like that. And so, what you need to do is be as specific as possible. Use words like "I will" or "I need to," compared to "oh, I would like to" or "I'm trying to." What they say, try is tomorrow's really yesterday. Like when you say, "oh, I'm going to try to," it that language itself gives you an escape to not do it.
Yes.
Um, so you need to have very succinct words, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect, but it sets your unconscious mind up for success by saying "I will" or "I need to." Just think about saying that out loud. Is like, oh, I will, and your brain's like, oh yeah, I will, or I need to. And when you think about that as it pertains to your boundaries, you may get this feeling, this uneasy feeling, and that is okay. As Magaly mentioned, like you have to have awareness about that, and you're gonna work that out. And so it's very simple. I'll give you an example. Say um, one of the things that you're thinking about is your financial, boundary, and it's saving. The boundary is putting aside money for your children, for schooling or whatever the case may be. And you think about, you got some knowledge on that, and you're starting to think, and you're like, all right, this is something that's important to me, based on your values and all these other things. And you need to think about, all right, who do I need to have this conversation with? Well, probably your spouse, because again, if you want one thing and you haven't communicated that with your spouse, can you still hear me? Okay, cool. All of a sudden my thing felt weird, so I didn't know if you can hear me. But you're going to need to have a conversation with your spouse, and it can go like this. You can say, "Hey, significant other, um, I need for us to save money for our child. And how I'm going to do this is I'm going to scale back on Starbucks or whatever the case may be to like 1 or 2 times a week. This will allow me to put X number of dollars into their account. Again, it's just it's it seems simple, and it is simple, but the simple things aren't always the easiest things. So that's why it's important to think about what is the dimension, what is the boundary, who you need to have a conversation with, and how are you going to tell them.
Yeah. It's like the who, what, where, when, why of boundary setting communication, right?
Yeah.
Any additional thoughts on communication? Magaly, I'll send it to you before I chime in with whatever I've got to say.
No, you just gave me a reminder of some people I need to have conversations with. That's all. It's important.
Yeah, I think the important thing to also think about when it comes to communication is the whole idea that, like, we were talking at the beginning about how, like, people can't read your boundaries. People can't read minds, right? And I'm definitely guilty of just assuming that, my family or just anybody just kind of knew what my boundaries were. And there's some people who, even if you try to explicitly say, what your boundaries are, they still find a way to break them, right? I love my mother. It was funny because they're in the process of packing some other stuff and just trying to clean their house, and so I gave them a space in our basement to pack their stuff, and then stuff started showing up in other rooms. And I was like, I didn't give you permission for that room, I gave you permission for that room. So having to reiterate and revisit the communication and doing it in a loving way, right? I know that sometimes when a boundary of yours is broken, sometimes your reaction could be harsh, because it's like you may have assumed that they received your boundary the first time, or when something is broken that you don't even realize that was going to be a boundary breaker for you. If you're paying attention to how, Magaly was saying earlier, pay attention to how it makes you feel. That's the time, especially when there's somebody else that's involved in the boundary, where you need to just speak up and say, like, hey, I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page, because that's going to save you so much stress from sorry, I got scared by something that fell. It'll save you so much stress from having, even more conflicting conversations, is by, once you notice that you're triggered, to, understand what the boundary, what about the boundary was being broken, and how can you either, shift the boundary so that it's a little bit more clear to other people involved, or, to just shift it altogether, and making sure that you're communicating appropriately. Do we have anything else to say on communication? I feel like there was something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember right now, so it might come to me later. And there's one more component to establishing healthy boundaries, and that is just allowing yourself to revisit and refine these boundaries regularly. It's like a triple R to kind of cap at the end. So when you set a boundary, things are, and we've said this already, but it's just another point to reiterate. The boundaries are always subject to change, depending on so many factors. Like with COVID, we might have had all these boundaries set around how we conduct our day. And then when COVID happened, we had to revisit this. All of a sudden, there was a boundary around not being able to leave the house. There was a boundary around, how we could communicate. And then, people were all on Zoom and, all these like meetings. And then there was Zoom fatigue. And so having to set boundaries around that. So, it's very obvious to know that, these boundaries have to shift. So we can't just say, hey, I'm setting this boundary and it's going to stay and it's going to be indefinite. So we constantly have to revisit and say what's working and what's not, and how do we change this. A lot of this requires being really proactive about what you want in life, and then also reflecting back on what is working and what's not working. As an example for me, my we had a kind of boundary around like making sure that we, had, specific family time, but we didn't really set any boundaries around what that would look like. And then sometimes we were doing too many vacations. And at one point I was like, I think we need to set a boundary around vacations, because I will come back from a trip and then I feel depleted. And, if we go on a trip the following weekend, then there's no time to recuperate, and it makes me not enjoy the vacation. And so one of the boundaries that we had set for my family this year before COVID happened was, let's not plan any trips, have like 2 weekends at home in between every trip. So we would just make sure that there was like time to just get back into the swing of life before we up and left again. And then it was just, we set a boundary on, we're never here in Chicago during the summer, so maybe we should spend more time. And we were able to get that through COVID because we just can't go anywhere. But it's just always remembering that the, outside, stuff that's happening that we don't even have control over can impact how we set our boundaries. So we have to constantly look at them, at the boundaries we set. And we don't have to like write down everything, but have that mental note about the boundaries that you're setting. And then also in terms of, putting things in place so that you don't have to think about, wait, I set this boundary. If there are rules that you want to create, then figure out a way, either in your calendar or, how you're going to communicate this so that you remember what your boundaries are, to make sure that you have them listed somewhere if you need to, and just as a way to make sure that, your boundaries are honored. And one of the other things, and then maybe this is somewhat off topic, but in terms of communication, is, I think a lot of boundaries can be hard to set sometimes when you are asked on the spot to do something. Like, hey, do you want to do this webinar with me? And they, your instinct in your mind is to say like yes, or hey, you want to go on this weekend trip with me? Any sort of thing where you're asked something on the spot. So allowing yourself to give yourself some space to think about it before you say yes is a great boundary to set. So, I had a friend that just asked me if I wanted to go on a trip in a couple months or so. And I said, let me think about that. I might be able to, but I just have to, I have to make sure that I'm mentally okay to take, to travel that weekend. So I didn't have to give up my power just yet, but to be able to think about it. So, do you guys have any thoughts on revisiting and refining your boundaries, or any other extra comments?
One thing you brought up a good point in just hearing that story, Apryl, of, once you have boundaries in place, there are going to be things that bump up against that. And it may be challenging to say no, but the cool thing about having boundaries, as Magaly mentioned, now your unconscious mind is sort of keeping track of that GPS, and it, in my opinion, I feel like it's easier for me to allow space between things that I would normally just say yes, 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 because again, one of my values is community and connecting with people, and it's easy to see things as oh wow, that sounds like a great thing, but I, as a rule, as a practice, is what, let me check in with the family with that. And as I'm watching Magaly's cup, I think it's the perspective. It looked like it was a giant cup that you were drinking out of. But I think now that I'm looking at it, it looks like a normal cup. But when she put it up to her,
no, it looks pretty big.
It's a big no, it is.
Okay, it is.
You're
okay.
Right.
I was like, that is a huge cup, and it completely threw me off track. Okay,
Mama needs
yeah,
coffee. Yeah.
hell yeah. And so if you have a challenge saying no, I found this really cool resource that I will put into the chat on YouTube, since there's no one here on Zoom, that gives you some thought starters on how to say no. And especially as Apryl mentioned, if you get approached to do something and, you have certain amounts of time and space for that, and maybe you don't have any extra space to accept that. Now you have to say no. And that's, in my opinion, and I'm speaking from personal experience, where that can sometimes be a challenge, and why we say yes is because, for whatever reason, you don't want to say no, oh, they might be upset, or you might miss out, FOMO, whatever the case may be. And I love frameworks, and so this gives a really cool, like, some examples of how you can say no in a respectful way. But the cool thing is, now that you have boundaries, um, you know, you need to honor them. They're not a boundary. Like, you went through all the work of identifying what are the dimensions, what are the boundaries, who you need to have a conversation with, and expressing them to, when something comes up and challenges it, to like back down. So it's going to take some work and practice.
Yeah, practice is huge. And then the only last thing that we were going to say, because I know that we need to start wrapping up, is that, setting boundaries is going to have a massive impact on you in so many different ways, right? It impacts, because of the communication, it impacts your relationships. It, can give you more energy to disperse to things that are more important to you. It helps with overwhelm for sure. And it just allows you to focus more. So there's a lot of other lasting impacts that I don't know if you guys have any other ones that I couldn't think of, but there's just so many different ways in a positive light that setting boundaries can really like up level the quality of your life, and that's kind of all that we're all about. Do you guys have any other final comments on that?
Final comments for me, people with people again with the traumatic backgrounds, like, it might feel icky in the beginning to set these boundaries up, but eventually when you start reprogramming yourself, you start readjusting yourself, you start feeling better, you start releasing anxiety, releasing stress, because you're finally setting these healthy boundaries for yourself. And setting healthy boundaries is self-love, and we all know self-love is
so important,
key to happiness. So yes, that was my final thoughts on that.
Yes. Gary, anything else? Good. Awesome. So we're just going to wrap up, and wanted to give Magaly the opportunity to share what she's up to. If you guys want to, follow her, she is a member of the Accountability Success Circle. So if you're watching this in the ASC, feel free to reach out to her at any time. I've known Magaly for a really, really long time. She's excellent at what she does, and we're here to support her. But if you're watching this on YouTube, this is also another, you can either join the ASC so you can mingle with all of us, or where can we find you, Magaly, and what are you working on and that you can share?
So I have monthly events focused on meditation and energy healing, and uncovering your unconscious programming through meditation and energy healing. But I've recently launched a membership that includes the events that I have. And again, they are meditation, energy healing, and workshops all around expanding your energy so you can release all of this negativity and welcome more creative energy into your life, and have a stronger connection with your higher self, and feel better, feel good, feel better. And yeah, so you can find me on my Instagram, mlamadrid.co, and that's also my website as well. Awesome. It's called Reset, by the way. Yes.
Awesome. Cool. And for those of you who are in the ASC, just a little preview for next month's webinar. It's October already, and I don't know but what happened to this year, but October is usually our year that we do annual planning, and we will do a webinar to kind of showcase to all of you. It's kind of like our annual thing where we help you, set yourself up for success for the next year. And we also have, hold on, let me just rewind a little bit, but because there's so much excitement around this. I love talking about it, but it's your opportunity to plan for 2021 before it even starts, because we know how ineffective sometimes that New Year's resolutions can be. So we take the time in October and the space to figure out what we want to accomplish, and then spend the rest of the year cleaning up what we wanted to get done with in 2020, and setting ourselves up for new. So that's going to be our next webinar sometime mid next month. But if you want to actually get hands down, in the dirt, and have a get it done weekend to go through all of this, we are doing our final few days of our early bird sale for our for our annual planning retreat, which happens on October 9th, 10th, and 11th. We have some really awesome stuff planned, and you'll take away like a full comprehensive plan of what you will be focusing on for next year. And you'll also learn some tips and tricks on and how to handle if unexpected things happen, and you'll play some games, and it's a fun weekend. We're doing it virtually because of the situations that are happening in the world today, but it'll be really, really awesome to bring together some really awesome people to just kind of get stuff done and have a plan going into 2021. So you can check that out as well. I'll put that in the notes on YouTube, and all of you in the ASC can see that in the events section. So, all right, thank you so much, Magaly, for being here and sharing your expertise. We're all going to go set some new boundaries, and we're 4 minutes past our end of our boundary for this webinar. So thank you all for watching this, whether it's on the replay or live, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, Magaly.
Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.